sweeping new tariffs on $18 billion in Chinese goods.
China will take resolute measures to safeguard its own rights and interests. The U.S. should immediately correct its wrong action and cancel the additional measures against China.
The United States and China both know that they're in competition for the #1 slot in the world, economically and technologically and militarily. Come to that, the stakes could not be higher, because who wins and on what basis will make a huge difference to the kind of world that we live in over the coming decades. Right now, America is trying to win by restricting the sort of advanced technology that China can get access to. And then, just as importantly, protecting its markets from massively cheaper Chinese products, such as electric vehicles. The thing is, on both fronts right now, there's evidence that America is failing. This video looks at how and why that's the case, and what might happen next. In 2022, the Biden administration passed the CHIPS and Science Act.
President Biden just signed a bill into law today boosting domestic semiconductor production and research in the United States. Top tech executives attended that signing in an apparent push to make the United States more competitive with China.
This was mostly about pouring money into the manufacture of semiconductors to get more of them being made in America and to make the US less vulnerable to supply shocks centered on Taiwan's TSMC. We covered this in the first video on this channel. But it also tried to directly hamper China's ability to compete at the more advanced end. Firms receiving any of this generous US funding were not allowed to make new high-tech investment in China or other countries of concern for at least a decade. Not unless all they were producing there were lower-tech, old-style chips designed to serve only the local market. In other words, China had to be prevented from being able to manufacture the most sophisticated high-end chips. Those required for artificial intelligence development, for instance. But more mundanely than that, the ones going into, for example, the latest generation 5G smartphones? That was the idea. It didn't take long for the brutal reality to come to the fore, because the very next year, in September 2023, the US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, the official very much at the heart of all of this, made a so-called goodwill tour to China. She spent much of a trip defending the US crackdown on advanced chips to the Chinese officials who lobbied her to relax these new stringent rules, but as if it had been deliberately timed to coincide with the visit, China's tech giant Huawei released its brand new smartphone, the Mate 60. It was powered by exactly the sort of high-end semiconductor the CHIPS Act had been supposed to keep out of the hands of Chinese companies. Some independent vendors selling phone cases for the new model went so far as to put photoshopped images of Gina Raimondo with text such as Huawei mobile phone ambassador Raimondo. It's about as in-your-face as you can get to someone on a goodwill tour of the country. Chinese media jumped on the release as a sign of the country's technological independence and superiority. Analysis of the phone suggested that that wasn't necessarily the case. It was likely to have hinged on the use of American technology and machinery, which should not have been possible due to the trade restrictions. But the fact is that companies like Huawei and its semiconductor supplier SMIC are capable of using a complex supply chain via grey channels to get the banned materials that it needed to make the chips. Douglas Fuller of Copenhagen Business School told the New York Times that SMIC had used equipment stockpiled before the restrictions applied, along with spare parts from third-party vendors to put it all together. One of the key problems was that, quote, the US has allowed SMIC continued significant access to American technology. For many in China, of course, the details didn't matter. Chinese social media commentators and news sites alike hailed the phone's arrival as rising up under US pressure. The US has responded recently by promising to restrict China's access to such chips more effectively, a position that's likely to remain regardless of who wins the US presidential election. But whether that means it can actually do that in practice remains to be seen. Meanwhile, at the time of making this video, Huawei, having shipped 10 million units of the Mate 60, is gearing up to launch the next generation, the Mate 70, which promises upgraded capabilities still. Now, stopping China from getting access to technology is arguably the hard part. The bit that should be easy, at least, is for the US to control imports, what gets imported to its own territory. One of the big focuses in that area, of course, is electric vehicles. In theory, because of the clean energy transition, you should want as many electric vehicles as possible, and the more cheaply you can get them, the fewer people will see a major barrier to them owning one, the faster the transition is going to be. And also, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. But, well, in practice, not usually so simple. Because America is not just one of the world's largest consumers of cars, but is also one with a long tradition of being the major manufacturer of them. Right now, China has a lot of electric vehicles, a positive glut of them in fact, which has helped to drive prices down. Such cheap cars from China are feared in America because they have the capacity to flood the market and hence, therefore, to put American firms out of business. Both President Trump and then President Biden responded to this threat with high tariffs aimed at the import of Chinese cars.
We'll put a tariff of approximately 100 to 200% on each car, and they will be unsellable in the United States.
I'm determined that the future of electric vehicles will be made in America by union workers.
Biden is making imports more expensive with a new 100% tariff on Chinese-made EVs.
This means American consumers will not get the opportunity to buy electric vehicles as cheaply as consumers can in China, but it also means that they will be more likely, when they do decide that they want and can afford such vehicles, they'll be more likely to buy American. At least if the policy works. As I say, in practice, well, let's just say it's a work in progress. In the face of the tariffs, Chinese electric vehicle makers have looked where else they can sell their cars. One of the top destinations has been Mexico. Last year, China exported $4.6 billion worth of EVs to Mexico, making it the leading supplier. Mexican customers have been responding positively to the affordable prices. China's leading brand, BYD, sells its Dolphin Mini EV for just over half the price of the cheapest Tesla. BYD has been exploring factory sites in Mexico, which Mexico, unsurprisingly, is keen to encourage, given the economic boost this would represent. Just one BYD plant promising to create around 10,000 new jobs. But it hasn't escaped the notice of US officials that such a setup could be used to get around trade restrictions, to get Chinese cars into the American market. The US-Mexico-Canada trade deal, negotiated by President Trump in 2020, could let Chinese cars built in Mexico enter the US free of any duties whatsoever, or maybe at a nominal 2.5% tariff rate. Such loopholes have led to the appearance, in spite of previous measures, of Chinese vehicles on the streets of America. One indicator of that, according to INA, Mexico's trade body for auto parts suppliers, 33 Chinese-owned companies with Mexican operations sent $1.1 billion worth of parts to the United States in 2023, up from $711 million the previous year. Like a high-stakes game of whack-a-mole, it's possible the US will then block that loophole, challenging Chinese firms to move to the next gambit. Trump has promised he would ramp up the tariffs if elected as president. The incumbent Biden administration boosted tariffs to 100% and additionally has just announced new rules to ban Chinese-developed software from any internet-connected cars in America. This latter move was justified on national security grounds. Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said this: "Many of these technologies collect large volumes of information on drivers, and this, he suggested, was particularly a threat for vehicles developed in China." But all of this produces a negative impact, at least as far as the current administration's concerned, since the higher prices for EVs will be a drag on the American economy and particularly will be a disincentive for consumers to make the energy switch. And there's one more loophole, just to demonstrate that the energy that goes into finding ways around rules is almost limitless and, one might say, admirably renewable. But before we get to that, if you've made it this far in the video, why not support this brand new channel by hitting the like button on this video and subscribing and hitting the notification bell to see more content like this when it's produced. Go on, I'll wait. There's a process known as the Tier 1 two-step. This exploits a loophole in American trade rules called the de minimis exemption, which basically means too small to be trifled with. It allows packages worth less than $800 to enter America without facing duties. It's an exemption that was first created in the 1930s to reduce hassle for tourists bringing home souvenirs from abroad. In 2016, the threshold was raised from $200 to $800. Why? To reduce the cost of enforcement. In 2018, tariffs were raised on Chinese products, suddenly creating a big incentive that didn't previously exist. And so you get trucks that head across the border from California to the city of Tijuana, Mexico. They offload their shipping containers just over the border, separate the goods contained therein into thousands of small packages, and then drive them back into America. Here's a graph showing the number of packages imported under the Section 321 duty-free program. Healthy growth, you might say. And the de minimis exemption may well be why what China says it sends to the US and what America thinks it receives from China has a $73 billion gap between them. Around half of that gap, at least, it is thought, could come from the use of de minimis rules. Now, again, some US lawmakers are pondering how to close such loopholes, but the problem they face is that it's many of the poorest households in America who benefit from the goods that come in this way, so there would be a political cost. They may look at it another way. For example, the large quantities of cheap clothing that come in from China as de minimis parcels, those are great for those poorer consumers, but a real pain for America's heavily protected textile sector. US retailers that import garments from China have to do so in bulk, so therefore have to pay the tariffs and custom fees. Shein and Temu, Chinese firms sending individual parcels to American consumers, well, they pay no import duties. Whether for better or for worse, and plenty of economists say it's the latter, America is leading the world into this new era of protectionism based on America First principles. Economists hate it because tariffs make prices higher than they need to be, stifle competition, protect local industries, meaning that they're not forced to improve and to innovate. But the additional challenge in the modern era, which, like it or not, starts with so many more supply chains connecting the world than used to be the case, is that it's just really hard to impose such policies in ways that actually stand up in practice. So expect this game to continue. New restrictions designed, new obstructions enacted, new loopholes exploited. All part of the battle for economic supremacy developing between the two largest world powers. The stakes are pretty high.